Today, we are ending this series called Investigating God. I had one more message in the series, but I didn't know Busch Gardens was on the horizon. So that message will just pop up somewhere else later this summer. But for now, we're going to conclude the series. And my whole goal in the series, and I think this is somewhat relevant, or maybe especially relevant as we celebrate grads this weekend, is that anybody who has left the church because at some point along the way they felt like their faith was not reconcilable with their life or their experiences, I just want to invite them to reconsider. And I also want to invite long-term Jesus followers who grew up like I did to actually kind of relook at their faith and in some cases grow up their faith, kind of grow in the robustness of their faith, to realize that Christianity is not fragile. And there's a lot of reasons that people walk away, and there's kind of an epidemic of that in our culture, as we looked at in week 1 with the none or religiously non-affiliated. I mean, there's 75 million, there's 44% of Gen Zers, and so this is a big deal. But the reason that I really want to invite people into this is because I don't want people living with the false dichotomy unnecessarily of doubt and despair. And this could happen because of questions about science or, pain and suffering, and God didn't answer my prayer, which I get that, or experiences, and it just felt like your faith was irreconcilable with what you'd experienced, and because you didn't want to pretend, and that's a lot of people, and a lot of people maybe watching or listening, you just walked away from it. But then there's this false dichotomy of maybe doubt about the scriptures or doubt about what you've experienced or about what you were told about God and then how your life has worked out that causes you to maybe consider walking away. But then on the other side of it, we don't always think about what we're walking toward. Because when you walk away from something, you walk necessarily towards something else. And this whole idea of no God or atheism, there's a lot of unsettling conclusions in that as well. And I think, as I've tried to be really honest in this series, like most series, is it's the fault of people like me or pastors of churches that in a lot of cases gave childhood answers to adult questions and they never allowed your faith to grow up. We want to change that. We want to work hard to change it. In fact, I've been so overwhelmed, honestly, the amount of you who've shared this series over the last 4 weeks, the amount of feedback we've gotten. This is the reason why we do what we do, that even fuels this type of series. In fact, a couple of them, I got this. I thought I was an atheist, but I realize now that I just don't believe in hype God. To go back to week 2, if you were here, that basically I walked away from a God that didn't exist. Or another one, I had no idea that there was a way to reconcile science and faith. And there's so many people that are in that place. It is a game changer to know that those two things are not in conflict. Also came from the series. And I've heard from so many other people, several stories invited 15 years away from the church, came back over these last couple weeks. I talked to another individual. It's like, I've been waiting my entire life for a series like this to explain some of these things, because if I would have heard it earlier, it may have saved me from a decade of walking away. And I heard from one other person, again, one of many, that told me they were firmly in the none category, like the religiously non-affiliated, and even over the last couple weeks have felt compelled to begin the first steps of following Jesus. And so that's why we're doing this. Last week, we looked at, in the third part of this, a Bible tells me so Jesus. And by the way, I was watching this coming back from a graduation. Bradley did an extraordinary job in that message. And if I can just plug it real quick, Bradley, who leads all of our student ministry, if you have a student and you care about their faith, that message last week is the reason that you should prioritize student ministry every single week. And I know there's a million things that you got to try to prioritize, and everybody seems to be overextended in our culture. If you care about their faith, that message last week is why what he is doing, is maybe taken the wrong way, but I'm going to brag on him, doing what few people are doing, that rather than just a faith in faith, or you should just believe, he is building the foundation of faith for kids so that when they leave to college and universities, it is not a straw man and they're taught to view the scriptures as first century followers did. That was an extraordinary message, and that's kind of my plug. You should do everything you can to get your students into student ministry. And last week, and if you weren't here, go back and listen to that message. He talked about the fact that Christianity does not exist because of the Bible. And this isn't just semantics. It's a big deal to understand this. It's actually the other way around. We have a Bible because something happened in history, a resurrection, that was a game changer that launched everything. I mean, after the crucifixion, nobody was reading a Bible. That's not what launched Christianity. It was an event that was documented in history, ended up being worth preserving, and people gave their lives for it, but a Bible did not create Christianity. I've said this for you before. Your birth certificate did not birth you any more than the Bible birthed Christianity. An event happened in history, the resurrection, that again was worthy of documenting, that relaunched the entire movement in the first century. No resurrection, no Bible. And that's such an important distinguisher for skeptics or college-age students or students, you're looking at something on TikTok or Chat GPT to understand that that is the anchor and the essence of Christianity. Now, what's really interesting, just go with me for a second, is that all throughout Jesus' ministry, Jesus actually pointed to himself and the Jewish scriptures to say the Jewish scriptures actually point to me. And then after the crucifixion, nobody believed that. They did not believe that the Jewish scriptures, what we now call the Old Testament, pointed to Jesus, because they thought if Jesus is dead, another wannabe Messiah didn't come through, he's a fraud, it didn't work out the way that we wanted. And then after Jesus resurrected from the grave, everything changes. And they begin to go back and relook at the Jewish scriptures to recognize that it actually does point to Jesus. In fact, the best example of this is in the Jewish scriptures, and again, what we call the Old Testament is Isaiah 53. If you've never read Isaiah 53, or it's been a long time, you should go back and read Isaiah 53. If you don't have a Bible, you can get it on your phone for free and read through that. And this is so extraordinary to me. Again, this was in their Jewish scriptures, written in 700 BC. Read Isaiah 53 and then ask yourself the question, who does this sound like? Who do you think that this points to? And after the resurrection, not before, after the resurrection, they began to relook at the Jewish scriptures to realize it actually did indeed, in fact, point to Jesus. And they took it seriously because it pointed to Jesus and because Jesus took it seriously. And we take Jesus seriously. Why? Because he predicted his own death and his own resurrection and pulled it off. And because he was able to resurrect himself from the grave, it gives validity to everything that he taught and said. So we take the Jewish scriptures literally, and we take them seriously, I should say, because Jesus did. But, hang with me, Christianity does not rise and fall on the Jewish scriptures. Even if you have questions or doubts or I'm not sure, how does this connect? And that's what many of you were taught in Sunday school. It does not rise and fall on the Jewish scriptures, and first century audiences understood this because they were closer to the action. It does not rise and fall on the Jewish scriptures. It rises and falls on the resurrection. That is the epicenter and the core of our faith. That even if you have other unanswered questions and things that you're not sure of, or things about the Jewish scriptures, or is that literal? That does nothing to undermine your faith if the resurrection in history is real. In fact, people follow Jesus after the resurrection because of the resurrection. I mean, after the crucifixion, again, nobody was reading a Bible. The crucifixion, or the Bible, I should say, didn't birth a resurrection. It was the resurrection that reignited people's faith and moved the Jesus movement beyond the first century. And here's what's also interesting. Just hang with me for a second. Is that the people in the first century, their faith was not mystical. It wasn't this, well, have faith in faith or just believe. For some of you, your big resistance, many of you who I've heard from, podcasting, watching, was somewhere along the way you had questions and somebody's like, well, just have faith. And you're like, well, that doesn't really help. Or I'm not sure if I believe, but you should just believe. And here's the Bible verse. Well, how do I believe if I don't believe? That was never the invitation of Christianity. And in the first century, their faith wasn't mystical. It wasn't even religious. In fact, I don't know if you ever thought about this. They barely had any faith. I mean, how much faith does it take when your leader and rabbi is crucified, you watch him crucified, and then you have breakfast with him on the beach and realize he is alive? Like, how much faith do you need to have when you are staring at somebody who resurrected themselves from the grave? Very little. That does not take a lot of faith. Their faith wasn't mystical. It wasn't overly religious. It was faith in the fact that God had done something. In fact, we'll come back to this, but this is so important. You become a Christian through faith, meaning All throughout, again, the scriptures and New Testament, some of you, this was presented so mystical, so ethereal. Just believe, just have faith. And you felt like you were intellectually dishonest because you had all these questions. Well, how do I just believe? But the invitation of Jesus, the invitation in the New Testament is you become a Christian through faith, meaning through faith in an event anchored in history with overwhelming evidence, the resurrection. And because of the resurrection, because Jesus rose from the dead, you hear me say this often, it validated everything he said, his life, his teachings, who he claimed to be. But the faith, becoming a Christian through faith, is faith in an event that points to Jesus being exactly who Jesus claimed to be. But this is so important. You become a Christian through faith. You do not become a Christian because of faith. It is not, well, just believe, just have faith. And here's the reason I tell you all of that. For some of you that you're a Christian, but you are so afraid of doubts, you are so afraid of science, you are so afraid of some objection that somebody is going to raise. What you need to understand that never has been taught to you is that Christianity is not fragile. It can hold up to the doubts. It can hold up to all of it is not in conflict with science. You do not need to be afraid. And then for others of you who are doubting, feel like you lost faith, you're losing faith, you should reconsider, because Christianity is not based on you just mustering up belief and faith and somehow throwing your intellect in the trash can. It is a robust intellectual faith where you have been invited to believe something that happened in history that validates who Jesus is. Now, thank you. That's the introduction. So I'm going to move quicker from there, and I promise I will, so calm down. I maybe overdid it with that, but I'm going to go really fast, this remaining part, because here's what I want to deal with today, and then we'll get you out of here. Just as what Jesus said about himself ended up being trustworthy, what Jesus said about God ended up being trustworthy. What Jesus said about God can be trusted. In fact, all throughout the Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the people that were eyewitnesses or they interviewed eyewitnesses who were there, who were with Jesus for all the miracles, all the teachings, over and over again, they write about what they learned about God from Jesus. Because over and over again, Jesus was putting on display what God is like. And if you are reconsidering faith or reconsidering God, this is the place to start. And I get you've had a bad church experience, unanswered prayer. You've had some people do horrible things in Jesus' names. I'm so sorry. But the place to start is not your church experience, not all the people who misrepresent Christianity. It is Jesus. Jesus is the best explanation of God. That Jesus came basically to show off who God is. And so John, who was incredibly close to Jesus, who was there for all of those miracles for several years, had a lot of conversations, side conversations, asked questions that weren't even recorded. I mean, he was with Jesus all the way. John is the guy who believed. Maybe this will encourage you. Then he disbelieved and deconstructed after the crucifixion. And then he believed again after he had breakfast with Jesus on the beach. And John later is exiled to an island by Emperor Domitian to the island of Patmos. He's toward the end of his life. And he's got a lot of time to think, obviously. There is nothing else to do. And it's hard to overestimate. This guy has seen so much chaos. You think the world's out of control? When people say that, and I don't disagree, but go back and study first century culture, a little bit of first century history. It'll make you feel better. So much chaos, so much bloodshed. He has seen pretty much every one of his friends martyred or die from acts of terror. I mean, it was unbelievable. And John at the end of his life, not because he just wants to muster up faith, but because he had been with Jesus, saw a crucifixion and then a resurrection, believed that Jesus was God in a body who had come to show off what God is like. And to reconcile some of our false dichotomies that maybe we tend to hold to. And with that context, here's what John heard Jesus say, and he recorded it. He said to his disciples one day, this is Jesus talking, if you really what? If you really know me, you're going to know my Father as well. Or basically, this is such a big statement. I say it all the time, but it makes Jesus a lunatic or the Son of God. No middle ground. If you know me, Jesus, like if you're looking at me and watching me, if you know me, you actually know God as well. You know God the Father as well. That's such a huge statement. And from now on, you do know him and you actually have seen him. And all of his disciples were completely confused. They're like, well, actually, we haven't, and we would like to. And so Philip is the first to speak up. He's like, Lord, show us the Father, and that is going to be enough for us. Like, we don't really know what you're talking about. But here's why we're here. We just want to know what God is like. So if you could just ask him to make an appearance, that would be cool. That's what we want. You're amazing, and we followed you for several years, and the miracles are incredible, but we want to know God, and just like a 5-minute appearance and maybe a Q&A, but we want to see, and we want to know God. And verse 9, and Jesus, I love Jesus does this all the time. He just ignores their question because he's getting to something bigger. And he's like, anyone who has seen me, again, this is Jesus, has seen the Father. And they're like, here you go again. But Jesus is like, no, just hang with me. This is such a big statement. The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, meaning what Jesus is about to reveal is I am God, and I also represent God, and I've come to show off what God is like. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. This is such a big deal, is what Jesus is saying. If you want to know what God says, not your experience, not your friend, not your grandmother's faith, not the denomination, not all the craziness that you see under the banner of Christianity, not, church history. If you want to know what God says, listen to Jesus. In this moment, Jesus is saying, if you want to know what God is up to in the world, watch me, watch Jesus. And then he says something that we miss and kind of gloss right over. Jesus says, believe me when I say that I'm in the Father and that the Father is in me. And again, it feels a little ethereal, a little over spiritual. And so Jesus knows this. So he's like, I know you guys are tracking with what I'm saying. And then he says something. This is all throughout the New Testament, all throughout Jesus' teaching, and somehow we miss it. Jesus says, I get this is a little bit, you're having trouble connecting. So Jesus says, or at least believe on the what? This is Jesus. At least believe, you should just have faith, but I don't believe. Just have faith. But I don't believe I've got questions. Doesn't matter. Here's a verse. Just trust God. Yeah, but I got questions. Doesn't matter. Just don't doubt. Believe. Have faith. Jesus says instead, no. At least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Basically, again, religious belief, and it wasn't really even religious belief, but this personal relationship that we've been invited into by faith and what God has done was never this mystical, religious, just believe kind of thing. It was, I want you to draw conclusions, Jesus would say, based on the evidence of, for us, what I've done at this point in history, what he was about to do. That's extraordinary. And it's what many of you were not taught growing up in Sunday schools. Your faith is so much more robust than just working up faith, just wanting to believe. Instead, God's done something. There's evidence that your faith is based on. So what I want to do for a couple minutes, what if you could throw out everything that you learned about God as a kid? And for the next 15 minutes, you could start over and just ask this question, what is God like? What is God like? Because Jesus came to reveal who God is. And all throughout the New Testament, you see Jesus over and over again explain that God is actually spirit. That over and over again, as he's making this designation of what God is like, one day he is arguing with he's not arguing, she's kind of arguing the woman at the well, which by the way, I think we get to heaven, she's gonna be like, I had a name. Could you have somebody put the name in there? Start calling me woman at the well, but that's all we've got. So the woman at the well is there basically arguing with Jesus, and Jesus makes this extraordinary statement as he's revealing to them who God is. And Jesus says, God is what? Spirit. And his worshipers must worship him in spirit and in truth. Just go with me for a second. I'm gonna try to break this down. Let me not lose you. This is exactly what the ancient Jewish people believed, and they were way ahead of us in ways that we don't even realize, because ancient Jews believed this idea about God, that he was immaterial, that he was spaceless, and he was timeless. That God was spirit, immaterial, spaceless, timeless. In fact, it was all of the pagan religions that worshiped the idols or worshiped the graven images. But it was this movement and these Jewish people that believed a Messiah was coming, that eventually showed up in Jesus, that from the very beginning believed that God was spirit, immaterial, spaceless, timeless. I'll tell you why that's a big deal and why this is so interesting. This is exactly what modern people and modern thinkers would expect. And we never connect the dots. We never connect the dots that that a lot of what you were taught is not opposed to the teachings of Jesus or the way of Jesus. Because this is what modern thinking would expect. Because there was, modern thinkers would say, a singularity somewhere in history, or a first cause, where God got everything moving and everything going, but there was a singularity that happened. An event that launched the laws that govern time and space and matter. And what we never realize is that Christians from the very beginning believed, and were way ahead of us, that there was an uncreated creator. That from the very beginning, now again, how God did all that, there's a lot of room there. But there was an uncreated creator. There was a first cause. Okay, so if you're talking to Jewish Christians, the first, tell us about the first cause. Immaterial, spaceless, timeless. And that first cause is, hang with me, above and beyond the laws of nature. The way modern thinkers would actually refer to it, it was supranatural. And then Jesus comes along in the first century, and he accommodates to the capacity of his first century hearers who did not know as much as you, read as much as you, have as much knowledge as you. And Jesus would just boil it down and make it very, very clear for them and put it in different language that God is spirit, which is exactly what modern people would think from an uncreated creator or an uncreated first cause. That some of the dichotomy, false dichotomy, some of the tension actually doesn't exist the way that you think it is. And God, revealed through Jesus, was way ahead of his time. But here's the thing, spirit is impersonal, and Jesus came to make God personal. One day, Jesus is hanging out with his disciples again, and he starts to pray. And can you imagine how intimidating it was to hear Jesus pray? Like, he's Jesus. And the disciples are listening to him, and they react the way I think all of us would react. They hear Jesus pray, he gets done, and they're like, we don't do it like that. So could you teach us to pray the way that you pray? Because that's next level kind of praying. And so Jesus gives this prayer, and it's not really a formula. It's just to tell us how to relate with a personal God. And in that prayer that many of us know, and again, we just kind of brush on by the statement, Jesus tells them, when you pray, say, our Father. This deeply relational term. Now, God is not male or female. God does not have a gender, because God is what? Spirit. But this is Jesus' attempt in the first century. And they understood this, in a way that, not understood it, but it connected with them in a way that's different for us in first century culture. Now, this is not the reflection of an earthly father, because this can go off the rails for some of us, because you immediately connect it to your experience. And, your dad might not have been, anybody to put as somebody to model. It may have been a train wreck. It may have been way off the rails. So he's not saying the reflection necessarily of earthly father. He's saying the perfection of father, if there's any way for our minds to wrap that around. And for them, father in their culture was everything. But the main point was this, not the father language. The main point was Jesus going, I want to communicate to you as best as I can how deeply personal and relational this is. That God is spirit. He is an uncreated creator. He the uncreated first cause, but he is also Father, deeply relational. He knows you. He knows what you've done. And even though he knows you, he loves you anyway. And that he is for you, that he is with you. This is deeply personal. It's deeply relational. It's unlike any other religion. And then one day, not only is God Spirit and God Father, John's writing a letter and he's thinking about what he had learned from God. And again, John was there all the way, saw every miracle. John had every side conversation over a fire, was able to ask him some of the things that maybe we wish that we could ask him that never got recorded. He was there every step of the way, and he's thinking about what he learned about God from Jesus. And he writes these words that, again, we've kind of become inoculated to. We sometimes just, again, don't even understand their significance in first century culture. But he writes these words that, no overstatement, have changed the world, that has completely influenced Western culture. And even if you're not sure about who God is, you've used this language, many of you. And John writes these words the first time this shows up in ancient literature, that God is what? Now, for us, many, again, even if they're not sure about theism or who God is, they will refer to statements, well, if there is a God, I believe that God is love. What we cannot really understand that is in the pantheon of gods, the gods were wrathful, they were random, they didn't like people. That's what was everybody's view of religion and the gods. And then John shows up and literally, through Jesus, who introduces this and introduces it in the upper room, adds this to ancient literature. For the first time, that in his essence or character, God's love. And here's John, who has been exiled to an island. Like he's rotting away on an island. He has seen more bloodshed than we can imagine. More chaos than we can imagine. Lost so many friends to terror and martyrdom in ways we can't even imagine. He has seen so much lack of love, it's hard to comprehend. And his point is not that the world is a loving place. The point is he was with Jesus, saw him die, and resurrected. And watched what Jesus put on display about God and was absolutely convinced that God, or Jesus was God in a body and that he was love. And so he writes these incredible words, God is love. And whoever lives in love lives in God. If you've ever referred to this, well, God's love, or maybe I'm not sure about Jesus, but I believe if there is a God, you just need to know. This was introduced by John in the first century. You recite that quality about God because of Jesus. God is love, and whoever lives in God, lives in love, lives in God, and God in them. And then you maybe know Jesus gathers his disciples. And this was where John got all of this from. The night he is being betrayed, is going to be crucified within hours, and says, hey guys, the defining characteristic for my movement is going to be for you to love other people, to love one another the way that I have loved you. And nobody is off limits. That I want you to move this forward. And I want you to love even your enemy, even those who persecute you. I mean, the thing about John is John had deconstructed and then reconstructed his entire faith because of Jesus. Because John grew up like every other Jewish person in the first century, and he believed that God loved Jewish people and he put up with everybody else. And that's the same thing that has been carried in different contexts from generation to generation. And every generation has their own idea of here's the good Christian people, and God loves them, and God just tolerates everybody else. And Jesus shows up and puts it on display, not with words, but with actions. They go, no, brand new deal, brand new news, good news for all people. I don't just love Jewish people. I don't just love religious people. I don't love people who don't have a past. I don't love people who are part of some subset or nation. God is love in his very nature, and I've come for all people. And John completely deconstructed and reconstructed his faith as a result. And the question is, okay, why was this the thing for Jesus to say the defining characteristic is love? And the answer to that question is because Jesus' very nature is love. That God is spirit, uncreated creator, that God ultimately is Father, deeply relational, and God ultimately is love. And Jesus, who came to put all of that on display, who is the best explanation of God, reveals ultimately who God is and what God is like. But here's the thing. None of that should surprise us as modern thinkers or modern people. Because the shade requires the sun. Like you can have a sun without shade. You cannot have shade without the sun. That shade, when you see the existence of shade, always requires the sun. And just as shade requires sun, evil requires good. Good must pre-exist evil. It's why you're aware, which means love must necessarily pre-exist unlove. Love must necessarily pre-exist unlove. You cannot have unlove first. You cannot have shade without sun. And John, who had seen so much carnage, so much bloodshed, so much chaos, gets to the end of his life and he's absolutely convinced that God is love because he recognizes the dots that we don't often connect is that good must precede evil for you to know evil. That love must pre-exist unlove for you to even have a category for it. This is why Jesus and God cannot be evil. This is why you should not be surprised as the New Testament writers, the individuals who are with Jesus, talked about the fact that God in his very nature is love. None of that should surprise us as modern people, modern thinkers, or intellectual individuals, because you recognize evil and justice because of your knowledge of good. You recognize, I recognize, we recognize evil and injustice because of our knowledge of good. In fact, in the New Testament, it talks about the fact that there is somehow this moral standard, and we want to chalk it up to maybe it's environmental, maybe it's just how I was raised, maybe it's this area of the country, but there are certain standards, Paul talks about this, that stand outside of us and they press on our conscience and we can't really avoid them. In fact, people will deconstruct because this thing, whatever you call it, this conscience things won't let them go. And so the answer to that is if I unhitch from God, maybe I can unhitch from the conscience thing, and yet it follows them. That there are certain agreed upon standards almost across the world, across the globe, where we'd go, okay, that's not right, or that's not okay, or there's an ought not. That there is this moral law written on our hearts and our minds and our conscience, and we didn't create it. Sometimes we don't even want it. It stands outside of us, but we can't really escape it because we recognize evil and injustice because of our knowledge of good. And whenever you appeal to ought not, they ought not to, my ex, my kid, my boss who's an idiot, that individual, everybody knows you can't do that. That's not right. Anytime you appeal to ought not. Anytime you appeal to justice, that's not just, that's not right. Anytime you appeal to ought not, anytime you appeal to justice, anytime you appeal to love, they should love me. They shouldn't be a jerk. They should at minimum standard, it shouldn't be a toxic work environment. They should at least take care of the kids. Whenever you appeal to any of those things, ought not, justice, and love, unknowingly, you are appealing to the essence and the existence of God. And for some who have listened throughout the series, we go, well, I'm not sure about Jesus, but I think God is love. The reason that you think God is love is because it was introduced by Jesus, documented by John, who made very clear that love pre-existed everything less than love. And in the moment when you say something like that, and I get it, you are appealing to this knowledge, this idea that you cannot have evil without good, you cannot have love without unlove, that all that pre-existed, that love pre-existed everything less than love, which is why we know, which is why we're aware. So as I close, here's the question I get though, and I dealt with this question at some length in our series, the Fundamentalist series back in the fall, and I've dealt with it multiple times and we will again. But I get the big question, okay, well, if there's a good God, why does a good God allow evil in the world? And that is a legit question. You should wrestle with that question. You should not be afraid of that question. And we've dealt with that. We'll deal with that again. But it is a legitimate question to ask, but that's not the question I want to end with, of why would a good God allow evil? The question I want to end with is, why do you know there's evil? Like, why do you know that there's evil in the world? Like, where does that... Why do you know the world is broken? Like, who says? What's the standard of broken or survival of the fittest? What is actually just complementary to that worldview? I mean, why is it broken? How is it broken? What is the standard of brokenness? And why do some people say this is broken and then other people say it's not broken? Like, where does any of that come from? How do you know that it's broken? How do you know that you're broken? I mean, that's the thing that's interesting that you got to grapple with sometimes, is getting to this place in life where maybe you're not sure about God, or you have doubts and you're kind of trying to escape it, and you don't want to live under a moral standard, and yet you stare up at the ceiling at night and you are dissatisfied with you. You feel like you let you down. I mean, many of us, and me included, have those moments like, I feel like I failed me. I feel like I let me down. And I don't know if that's God, you might say, or I don't know where that standard came from, but how is it that you feel like you're broken? Why are you broken? Where did the standard come from? How did you let you down? Who said you let you down? And why should you love? Why should your kids love? Why should you love? Why should there be love for people that you don't even know in the world? I mean, where did that come from? Why is it broken? Why are you broken? Why should we love? And then when we fail, a lot of times we'll say things like, well, nobody's perfect. Nobody will excuse it with nobody's perfect. How do you know what the standard of perfection is? What's the line? What's the threshold? Where did that come from? And John would say, it's perfect love that preceded us. It's perfect love that preceded you. That just like you cannot have shade without sun, you cannot have evil without good, you cannot have love without unlove, that something pre-existed and preceded all of it, that is your foundation, is the reason for your knowledge, is the reason that you even know, because God is spirit. He is an uncreated creator. He is an uncreated first cause that holds all things together. And he is deeply relational. He is Father, or whatever terminology you want to use to equate the fact that God is deeply relational, that he loves you, that he's for you, and he knows you. And even though he knows you, he has promised, I will never abandon you. And that God, in his very character, is love. And part of the reason that you know that is because you are aware of anything less than love. Because you have a standard. And so if you're reconsidering faith, the place that I constantly want to point you to is the best explanation of God is Jesus. So I get some of you were unloved right out of the church. Some of you have experienced the most hateful things imaginable with a Bible verse. Some of your questions and doubts were shut down and you were condescended to and you were given another, well, just have faith in faith. Some of you walked away from a denomination where you saw things done in leadership where you're like, if God's like that, I don't want anything to do with God. I can only imagine, and I am so sorry. But despite that treatment, despite what you've seen in culture, despite your upbringing, despite Sunday school God, those things in many cases are nothing like Jesus. And Jesus said about himself, I'm the best explanation of God. And so for you, maybe the starting place is to get to know or re-get to know Jesus. And if you're a Jesus follower, I say this all the time, but you have doubts and questions that you don't even know are coming yet. And with everything in you, you need to build your faith and grow your faith around the message, the movement, the life, the teachings of Jesus, who said, all authority has been given to me. How you interpret the scriptures, culture, yourself, how you view the world, all of it comes down to Jesus. So this is the starting place for some of you, and we're going to be done. This last semester, we did an Old Testament survey class. I would so encourage you when we offer those again. I taught part of those, some of our other staff. From the feedback we got, really helpful for a lot of people. Just take a next step if you're curious. Been in faith forever, not sure about faith. Take a next step for all the things that we offer. Old Testament, New Testament survey, understanding the scriptures, understanding how Jesus relates. In some cases, breaking down the false dichotomies that you've been presented. For others of you, I would so encourage you to start here. You find the book of John. You can get an app, the Bible app on your phone, and just Message translation or Message paraphrase, if you want to paraphrase, New Living Translation, NIV, all of those work. But you just begin to read through the book of John and ask this question over the coming weeks. What do I learn about the Father from the Son? What do I learn about God the Father from Jesus? Because for some of you, and I don't want to oversimplify because I get there's a wrestling. For some of you, this right here, even with all you've experienced and all your questions, it will revolutionize your faith and your view of God. And maybe for many of you in our kind of evangelical church culture that sometimes gets completely connected from Jesus, you will realize with clarity you never had before by looking, watching, reading Jesus, that he is nothing like you thought. Because Jesus said, if you want to know what God is like, how God thinks, how God responds, watch me, listen to me, follow me. You guys stand with me. Jesus, thank you so much that you gave us so much to work from. I've heard from so many people in this series, and all the stories kind of seem similar. And we were presented with a faith that felt like it had no legs under it. In some cases, was kind of a house of cards. It felt fragile, felt like we couldn't question, felt like we couldn't doubt. That we raised things and were just met with not adult answers, but just to have some faith. I thank you that you gave us so much more than that. I pray that you would continue to help us as part of this movement and a part of the larger network, the Irresistible Church network of helping churches with this all over the place, that we would begin to build better foundations for kids and for students and adults, that you've done something in history that validated who you are, and that our faith is not just mustering up belief or some kind of mysticism. It is faith in that event that ultimately validated who Jesus is, his identity, his character, that he is worthy of following. And so I pray you'd help people that are just beginning the journey to follow, and they don't even believe yet. Give them the courage to take a next step. I pray for Jesus followers who have been maybe parts of this series a little bit disorienting for them. They got to go back and rethink some stuff. I pray that you would give them the courage to want to grow up their faith and mature their faith. Thank you that we have the kind of church, I've prayed this throughout the series, but it's not lost on me, that we can have these conversations. I realize how different this environment is, tackling these things and the way that we're tackling them. It just would not happen in many places. Thank you for these people. Thank you for what they're doing here. And God, just give us the wisdom to know what you'd have us to do, and then the courage to actually do it. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.